for today, just 2 seconds. You can come and watch over my shoulder if you want, Niels. I've got Niels in the room with me, who's one of the other Reggers who's come to join as well. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about what wellbeing is, or at least what we've tried to talk of it as, what burnout is. I'm then going to go over some self-care tips. So I've got 4 top tips that I try to sort of use for self-care. And the idea of that is to promote my own well-being and to recognise when my well-being is perhaps not where it should be. I'm going to talk a bit about local support, and this is very much a conversation in progress, and is an area that we're very much developing. And then I'm going to spend just the last few minutes talking about blue skies for wellbeing and burnout in the NHS, because if you can't do blue sky thinking for wellbeing, then what can you do it for? I'm not going to talk to you about research and studies and numbers, and there are lots of reasons for that, but really I wanted to use this as an opportunity to develop an understanding, or a shared understanding, of what we think wellbeing is, particularly here at Sherwood Forest, and what burnout means to us individually, but also as an organisation, and then to share the self-care tips. Okay, so what is wellbeing? So really, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because well-being, there's 7 billion people on this planet, and well-being applies to every single one of us. And I think that's really important. But whilst it applies to every single person on this planet, it's really, really important to understand and appreciate that the individual subjective experience of well-being is precisely that. It is individual and subjective. And despite that, our well-being affects how we interact and connect with the people around us. And that's our colleagues, our friends, our family, all of it. And so actually having an awareness and appreciation for the fact that everybody has their story to tell is really important when we're thinking about what well-being is and what it means to individuals and then to the groups that we're part of. This is an extract taken from a book called Man Down. So the full title of the book is Man Down, Why Are Men Unhappy and What Can We Do About It? And for me, this extract really sums up the individuality of well-being, but in a sort of roundabout way. So Matt Rudd, who's the editor of the Sunday Times magazine, has written this book, and he says, on paper, men have done everything right. They've ticked all their boxes, they've got the house, the car, they've got the careers, all of the things that we're told we need to have a successful life. And this is possibly my favourite bit. Most importantly, they're not women, because it would be much harder for them if they were. But jokes aside, really what this does is say we live in a society where we're told what we need to achieve to establish our well-being, to tell us that we've done well, that we've succeeded. But does having those things and checking those boxes equate to a sense of well-being? And Matt Rudd would argue that it doesn't. And I think that's really important to underline that idea of subjectivity. So what matters to individuals is what matters to the individual. What's right for you can only really be decided by you. And so how do you define something that is so individualized? And I think the answer is that you don't. So despite the fact that wellbeing has sort of been a field in development for probably 30 going on 40 years now, if not before, depending on how you view the philosophy, there isn't a universal definition of what wellbeing means. So when I first started doing these presentations, I Googled what wellbeing is. And these are some of the things that came up. So what I've tried to do here is sort of highlight the words and the phrases that I think, or that the wellbeing literature would have you form as part of a definition of what is wellbeing. But I think all it serves to do is highlight the subjectivity, that it's a state of being rather than an action or something that happens to you. And the achievement of it is demonstrated through feelings and experiences that are very personal and central to you. However, the one thing that I did want to flag up here is the word sustainable. And I hadn't really considered this previously, but actually the things that we do to maintain our well-being or to improve our well-being have to be sustainable. And I think that's really important, working in the fast-paced and high-stress environments that we're used to working in. There are also a few things that I don't agree with, that I don't think fit in with what well-being is. So the first of that is to be healthy. So obviously, everyone wants to be healthy. Nobody wants to suffer ill health acutely or chronically. But I think it does a disservice to many of our patients out there and family and friends who live with long-term, chronic and even terminal diagnoses who are still able to live a well life in the context of well-being. And I don't know, some of you out there might have followed Richard Mitchell on Twitter, and in fact his blog last week shared an article by a young man with a terminal cancer diagnosis. And for me, so there were lots of things to learn from that article, but for me, the underlying message was about having a sense of well-being and meaning and purpose. And that's a young man with a terminal diagnosis who has sadly since passed away. Those of us who are involved in and following the study of or the understanding of well-being, I would argue against the absence of negative as being fundamental to experiencing well-being. So we all live in the real world, we all have real lives, and our lives ebb and flow with the turning of the world. Actually, there isn't any way for us to guarantee the absence of negative emotions in reaction to life. We are going to experience them, but it's how we experience them that matters. And then I've circled the word prosperity, because I don't know anybody who would turn their nose up at more money, but does having more money equate to being well in a well-being context? I don't know. And I think people's views on that would differ. And so what is it? So I hope that I've persuaded you that it is subjective. And if you've got a pen and paper, you could just take a few seconds to write down what it means to you. But I think there'll be some common and shared themes. So really, it's partly about having a desire to look for and find the joy in the task that you're doing or the day that you're having. And it's having the freedom to enjoy that, the high, really live presently. But it's also about having the headspace to take the lows and what you do with those lows. So there's something about a growth mindset, which could be a whole talk on its own, but having the freedom of mind to absorb the low points in life and then reflect back on them. And that can take courage. It's difficult to have confronting conversations about yourself with yourself. But if you're in a good place in terms of well-being, then arguably you should be able to do that. I've come to realise that it's a conscious choice. So it's really easy in the world that we live in, the speed with which life moves, to get wrapped up and dragged along in the currents. But actually, it's about taking a step back, actively choosing to engage in a process to improve your own well-being. And there is an acceptance that it's a dynamic process, and some days will be good and some days will be bad or less good. But it's about accepting that difficulty. So I'm sure most of you will be able to recognise and at least empathise with, if not identify with, this person who's juggling all the balls of life. And I don't know about you, but sometimes it feels like I have many more than 5 balls that I'm juggling at any one time. But really, what we should try to do, or what we aim to do, is divide up those different parts of life into what's known as dimensions. So within wellbeing literature, the use of the word dimensions helps us to frame the different aspects of our life that contribute to our wellbeing. If you Google dimensions of wellbeing, you will get thousands of different images that look like this, but are all slightly different. But but your well-being is the sum of all the small parts of your life. And those small parts could be represented as they are in here by pictograms or infographics. But the point is that they form a whole, which is you. So, for example, here, physical health is represented by the heart, and the financial aspects of life are represented by the dollar sign. The dimensions aren't set in stone, and they might change depending on the context. So this, for me, is a really good example of the dimensions of life in general. But I could talk about my well-being at work and where my dimensions might be, for example, my networks, my relationships, professional development, or the time I have for professional development, exams, etc., etc. So, and one of the things that I really like about well-being is that it isn't prescribed. It's so individualized, and everything that you see here in this presentation is more or less a guide, and sharing the things that I've learned along the way. So if we take our dimensions, and each of the colours in the dimension is representing one of the balls that the person is juggling, what we really want to be able to do is to get them balanced and lined up. And even if it's just delicately balanced, at least they're balanced rather than flying around at risk of dropping one. So some of this is about taking some control and ownership over the dimensions in life, and I'll come on to control in a little while. But the other thing that's really important to remember, and I think sometimes we do ourselves an injustice on, is how much the different dimensions of our life interact with each other. So if you take it back and pare it back really simply, so if you talk about work and home dimensions, if things are going badly at work, then it's likely that they'll spill over into how you are at home, even if it doesn't directly impact your home life, and vice versa. And so you can see that by losing the balance on one area, it's very easy to then have a ripple effect that trickles into other dimensions of your life and leaves you feeling overall less well or unbalanced. So for me, and this is the summary line for me about well-being, so whilst well-being is all of these things, actually it's a feeling of inner balance and inner equilibrium. And ultimately, what I feel as being balanced and in equilibrium will be different to what those of you out there are experiencing. So that's a quick tour of what I think well-being is. I don't know if anyone's got any questions or would like to ask anything now about well-being. If not, I'm happy to carry on.
There wasn't any questions in the chat room, just a few couple of comments just relating to Richard's blog. So I've put the link up there if anybody wants to catch up.
Okay, thank you.
And then just a few comments about being content, and that it was such a great point that you raised about being able to experience just general being despite or even because of difficulties. So no questions as such.
Yeah, I'm glad someone's raised that, actually, because so I when I first got interested in this, I struggled with the Americanisms in the language about well-being, and a lot of the reading that I do is based within American literature, and that will become apparent in the next bit as well. But actually, there is something about living in the present moment and experiencing what you're experiencing now. And I'll just a quick anecdote and I'll move on to burnout. So as part of this, one of my own strategies for wellbeing is the practice of mindfulness, and that's partly about experiencing the feeling that you're having for itself. So whether it's pleasant, whether it's unpleasant. And I remember one day being in the gym trying to do a plank, and all I could think about was how hard the floor was on the palms of my hands, and I just wanted to stop. It was painful, I was uncomfortable. And then I sort of disengaged and thought, actually, I'm just going to focus on the palms of my hands. And when I did that and engaged with the sensation, I suddenly found that time passed quite quickly, and that I was able to just do it and live in that moment without thinking about consequence, etc. Obviously, we need to think about consequence, but that's just an anecdote of living in the moment, experiencing the feelings, whatever they are. And I don't always get it right. That's the other important thing to say. So if you're happy, I'll move on to burnout, and hopefully it will be clear to see how the two are interlinked. This is Herbert Freudenberger, who is an American-German psychologist, and he had many careers, but in the end made his final career in the interest and study of an understanding of burnout. So he's the first sort of original works to be published. So these books came out right at the end of the 70s, early 80s. And it's really interesting because a lot of the things that he says, particularly in the first chapter of his first book, are still hold true today. So I think we'd all agree that burnout isn't something that we should ignore. It doesn't go away or disappear if you just soldier on. And I hope increasingly that we're starting to realise that it's not something for people to be embarrassed about or ashamed of. It's something that any one of us could experience and probably does experience to some degree at some point in life. He did most of his studies within helping professions, as he called them, so nursing, doctors, teachers, social care, that kind of setting. So high energy in terms of the amount of energy we give to our professions. So all of, I think, these premises that he's identified still hold true to this day. But for whatever reason, and whether it's misinformation or lack of understanding, I think that he also set the tone for some unhelpful conclusions and thoughts about burnout. So if these are taken directly from his book, The High Cost of High Achievement, where he refers to people who experience burnout as they, or a burnout, or the person. And what I don't like about the way he's described it is that there's something very accusatory about the tone, as if the individual should be held accountable for the experience that they are having. And I think what that's done is the legacy of that is that it's the dialogue that we've continued to have has set us on a slippery slope towards pinpointing and signalling out individuals. He did describe some of the well-recognized phenomena now that I'll come on to in a second, like fatigue and frustration. And although he's identified fatigue and frustration, the legacy for me of this is the stigma that comes from being labelled as burnt out. And interestingly, the Royal College of Physicians, the president of the Royal College of Physicians, who is a physician at Derby, when he took up his presidency of the Royal College, he basically vetoed anybody from using the phrase burnt out because it had such negative connotations with it, which I think is a real shame. So we've got a lot of work to do in unravelling the many, many years of the way the language has been constructed around burnout. But I think we can do it. And thankfully, the World Health Organization, only as recently as last May, recognised within its revision of International Classification of Diseases that burnout is an occupational phenomenon, not a medical condition. And it actually comes under the chapter of factors that influence health status and contact with health services. So hopefully the tide is starting to turn on the language around burnout and the way in which we identify people who are experiencing burnout and why they might be experiencing burnouts. I think it's a small step and I think it will take time to change, but I think it is possible and I hope that this will be helpful. So just a bit more detail. So the World Health Organization recognises that burnout is a constellation of experiences and feelings that an individual will have in response to chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And one of the things I wanted to raise here is that we all experience stress, and not all of that stress will be because something has not been well managed. So I can talk in my context. For example, when I'm on call as a medical registrar in resource in A&E, I find that stressful, partly because there's a lot of unknown, partly because of the volume, partly because of the pace. It's a difficult job. But when I am experiencing it in a positive way, that stress is a positive emotion, and it helps to drive the work that I do, and it helps to inform the way I do things. The difference with feeling burnt out, or those who are experiencing burnout, is that they will not have the energy, they will be too exhausted to utilize those feelings of stress and adrenaline in a positive way, and rather they will begin to associate it in negative or cynical views of their job. And ultimately, the final sort of the bottom line is that then this impacts their ability to do their job. I still think, though, that the World Health Organization's characterization of burnout misses a trick, because for me, 21st century healthcare and the system that we work in is about prevention, not cure. And so for me, it's the exhaustion that is really the early warning sign. And it isn't it's not just tiredness, it's that deep-seated in your bones, I don't want to do this anymore, I can't face going back to work, an inner weariness. And if we can just start to recognize that in amongst ourselves and in amongst our colleagues, hopefully we can start to prevent people slipping down that slope and developing the full constellation of experiences that would have them labelled as experiencing burnout. And I hope I'm conveying the difficulty with language around burnout. I'm deliberately hesitating in the way I say things, because I think we have to be really careful about how we do this. So for me, the central tenet and the central principle of burnout is exhaustion. And so if you imagine yourself constantly pushing against an empty tank and constantly trying to do things despite the fact that you feel you've got nothing left to give, it's easy to imagine how that delicate feeling of equilibrium quickly starts to become unbalanced, and then you find yourself back to juggling balls. And I think this is important because it goes back to the principle of dimensions, and the dimensions interacting with each other in your own state of well-being, but also within your ability to do your job, or our job. So one of the other things about burnout, though, is that with every story, as with every story, there are two sides to the argument. And so obviously the individual who is experiencing burnout has a very subjective and individualized experience that they are living through. But it's really important to remember that on the other side of that will be your employer or the employer, if we recognize burnout as an occupational phenomenon. So central to the prevention and the management of burnout has to be the employee-employer relationship. And if I talk about that in terms of Sherwood Forest, that it's that interface between what's going on out there in the real world versus what we're trying to achieve as an organisation. So if I can just take, I said I wasn't going to talk to you about studies and trials, etc., but I just want to quickly share with you some results of the work that I did last year on burnout, for those of you who haven't seen it. So very quickly, I surveyed all of the doctors in the trust, and we used the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory to explore levels of burnout amongst our doctors. The scale goes from 0 to 100. So on average, our doctors are scoring around 46. So they're 46 out of 100. Obviously, the lower their score, the less burnt out they are. So 46 is middle ground. What I don't know is if this is a normal number. I don't know what the rest of the country looks like. What I don't know is if it's a normal distribution of scores. But what I do know is that 42% of people who responded to my survey scored over 50 on the burnout survey, which means that they are moderately or more burnt out. I'm just going to leave that with you as a little teaser. If anyone's got questions about that work, I'm more than happy to be contacted. It's still ongoing, or I'm more than happy to discuss it. Okay, so before I go on to self-care, is there any questions in general about burnout or any comments?
Hi, Rue. There wasn't any questions again. I can't see anybody with hands up. But we've had a few comments. So Rachel very kindly shared that that's what occupational therapy aims to do from a well-being and mindfulness point of view. So they focus on meaningful and purposeful occupation and engagement with individuals to help them lead a fulfilling life. Okay. So Rachel shared that comment, and then this might be one to pick up offline, but Sally asked in response to the survey that you did on burnout if there was a response rate in the surveys of medics.
As in what the response rate was?
I'm not sure, possibly. Sally, I don't know if, oh, she's put yes.
Okay, so it went out to 400 doctors and 180 replied.
Lovely, thanks.
Which Will. I was pleased with, quietly pleased with. We could do better, but I wasn't expecting so many to respond or to fill it out.
Lovely, thank you.
That's okay. Okay, so in that case, I'll go on. So I'm going to share with you my 4 top tips for self-care. And again, so all of the things that I'm going to share are recognised within health and wellbeing. And what I should have said at the start is my background is that I have a certificate as a health and wellbeing coach. So these are all techniques that I learned about in that training, but they're techniques that I use for myself. And one of the things about health and wellbeing that I've come to realise is that the more we talk about it, the more open people are to engaging with it. That doesn't mean they have to share their experiences, but I am happy to share my experiences. So these are all from me to you, so to speak. So just as a quick refresher, I just wanted to remind people about dimensions of well-being. So I've chosen to use this image because I think it encompasses many dimensions, certainly applicable to me. But your dimensions might look slightly different. There might be some that aren't on here, or some of these might not apply to you, and that's fine. Okay. So my first tip, accepting what you cannot change. So accept what you cannot change. I find this to be really powerful, and it sounds strange because it's so obvious. But Stephen Covey, who wrote this book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I haven't read the whole book, but he talks in the book about the difference between proactive and reactive people. So if you imagine yourself standing in the middle of your dimensions, and you have all of the things on a day-to-day basis that worry you, that influence you, that impact your decision making through the day, or that preoccupy you. Some of those will be within your control, and if not in your control, they'll certainly be within your influence. And the argument is that proactive people spend most of their time addressing those things that fall within their circle of control and their circle of influence. And the more that you spend time within your circle of control and circle of influence, the more that you find that those spheres grow, and you find you're able to absorb more tasks into your circle of control and your circle of influence. But outside of the circle of influence and circle of control is a circle of concern. And what you'll find in there are the things that you really just can't change. They just don't fall under your remit. It isn't to say that they wouldn't at some point or couldn't at some point. So some of them will be able to cross over. And Stephen Covey's argument is that the more you expand your circle of influence and circle of control, you will find that your circle of concern becomes smaller, whether that's because you let go of some things that you have no control over, or because you find you have more headspace to deal with the things that you didn't have any control over previously. So If it's helpful, just take a few seconds to think about 2 or 3 things that are going on in your life at the moment, and think about where they sit. Do they sit within your circle of control, your circle of influence, or your circle of concern? So I had a go at this last night, and I just jotted a couple of things down. So for me, it sounds ridiculous, but the American election really worries me from time to time if I find myself engaging in conversation with my husband about the bigger issues. And I mean this genuinely. When I was pregnant with my first child, it was general election here. And I remember spending significant amounts of time listening to Radio 4 and getting really worked up about things I just had no control over. And I just don't do it anymore. So when I find myself slipping into that routine, I check myself. And then there's my final year appraisals coming up, and I'm nervous about it. And there are certain things about it that I can control, certain things that I can influence. And so I've got to take those things and do what I can with those things and shelve the things that I can't influence about the process. And then I'm one of those people who used to use the excuse of having no time to exercise to do no exercise. But latterly, I've realised that actually it's a choice that I make, whether that's conscious or not. But it's an active choice to exercise rather than not having the time to do it. So I hope that makes sense, but accept what you cannot change is my starting tip. And then get to know yourself. So getting to know your dimensions. So if we take my wheel of dimensions as a premise, there is a tool called the Wheel of Life that is used by health and wellbeing and other coaches. And it's an internationally recognized technique. I think that the symbolism of the wheel goes back way back into Buddhism. But the Wheel of Life as a coaching tool is much more recent than that. And it was developed by someone called Paul Meyer, a man called Paul Meyer. The idea of the Wheel of Life, and I'm going to go through an example with you in a second, is that it gives you a helicopter view of your life, and it helps you to just have a quick snapshot view of how balanced life is. Again, there isn't a single wheel of life that applies to all of us. So it will be context and what's going on in your life and what your dimensions are that make up your wheel. But if I move on to the next slide, so it's really simple. So you start with a wheel of life and start with a dimension. So I chose physical environment. So you score between 0 and 10 how happy you are or how content you are with that particular dimension. And the idea is to not think about it too much. So your instinctive response. When I've done this previously in other talks, I used a Wheel of Life from when I was on maternity leave. And I remember filling it out instinctively. And I remember anticipating that I was going to score my career quite low. So I was expecting to instinctively score it 4 or 5 and scored it 6 or 7, just when I did it without thinking about it, which was a real eye-opener for me. So you score all of your dimensions and then you link up the dots. And the idea is that it gives you a wheel. And obviously the wheel is supposed to be round rather than have jagged edges. So there are 2 ways to look at this now. So as with my previous experience, it was really good to score my career higher than I thought I was going to, because it made me stop and think, oh, actually, I'm happy with that, or something's going right. I need to understand what it is that's going right, and I need to keep doing that thing or hold on to that thing. Whereas, for example, on this wheel, I've scored personal growth quite low compared to other areas, and it goes back to that comment I made about making up time for things. Which is something that I feel I need to be better at. I find this a really powerful tool. I sense check it, and I probably engage with it every 2 or 3 months, maybe a bit longer, 3 or 4 months. But it's just really good to have a quick snapshot and overview. And for those of you who are interested in coaching, it's a really useful tool to either use when you're being coached or as a coach to help to guide conversation and to set goals. And goals are really important for direction, although they don't define well-being. Okay, so a lot of this is about exploring yourself and exploring your own understanding of yourself. And the next thing that I want to talk about is triggers. So we all have triggers and we all experience them. And sometimes, as I've mentioned earlier, well-being relies on you being able to have frank and honest conversations with yourself, either about the way in which you've reacted to something or the way in which you've handled something. And that might be a good experience or a negative experience, but it's the process of learning from that experience that's important. And many of us will share the same triggers, but we'll have our own individual response to them. So, for example, if I think about my job, so I'm on call tomorrow night in a hospital that I've never done an on-call at overnight before, and I know that 3 or 4 years ago that would have really worried me. I would be anxious about it. I wouldn't really want to do it. I would think of all the things that could go wrong in my on-call. So just knowing that it was coming up would have an impact on my well-being and therefore my interactions with my home life, my work life in the days leading up to it. And so now whenever I know I've got an on-call coming up where I feel like it's unfamiliar and I don't really know what to expect, I just take some time to try and get to know some processes and ask people what to expect and where to get help, especially for the things that I know I would struggle with. And it sounds really obvious, and I hope it doesn't sound patronizing, but I honestly came to that quite late in life. And I don't know if that was pride or if it was just lack of experience, but it's that ability to step outside yourself, look at yourself and say, you're feeling that way because X, Y, and Z. What can you do about it? And it's not easy. And then coping strategies. So get to know yourself and your coping strategies. So much like triggers, we all have coping strategies, and some of them will be healthy and some will be less healthy. And I try to be pragmatic about this. So for me, as I've said, well-being is about balance. And so I think it would be remiss of me to say or to suggest that we shouldn't have unhealthy coping strategies. I don't think that's realistic. But it's about recognizing when less healthy coping strategies start to become habit and therefore become damaging. So this is taken from a website called Connecting for Health, and their list is much more extensive than this, but essentially it's a table with various common coping strategies, and the idea is that you tick or mark the ones that you use. So, for example, when I'm feeling stressed, I definitely eat high-calorie foods. I'm definitely more likely to say yes to a glass of wine offered to me. But I do also try to employ some relaxation and mindfulness techniques, and I tend to try and read more. So the idea would be to recognise that eating high-calorie foods and drinking more wine, although might form part of my coping mechanism, wouldn't be advised to do them more often, and perhaps focus more on doing things like reading and mindfulness. And again, I'm pragmatic about it, and I think it's really important that we're pragmatic about it. We're all human, and some days it's easier to do than others, and some days you just don't want to do compared to others, and that's okay. But it's about developing that awareness and that honesty with yourself. But ultimately, and this is a slide that I threw in last night, so I feel like it's really easy to sit here and talk about all of the things we should do and all of the views that we should hold, when actually what we are all struggling for is time. And it's really easy to say that we should make time, but I do hope that as we go forward, some of that time won't be time that we've had to fight for, but as we talk more about well-being and the importance of it, not just for ourselves, but for the people who we work with, the patients who we look after, it is important that it just becomes part of what we do. And that's something that I would aspire to. Does anyone have any questions about the top tips or feedback or comments?
Don't think there's any questions, Rue. Just a couple of comments. So Sarah Stones in the library very kindly mentioned that they've got some copies of the Covey book in the library at Kingsmill Hospital.
Oh, yeah.
So if anybody is interested in having a look through those, then we've got those. And then Rachel shared that they use the Wheel of Life with their patients. And that the coping strategies also help develop resilience, which then directly links with well-being as well. And then we've had somebody asking if they recommend the Covey book, which I assume would be a yes. I'm guessing that there's probably lots of other different strategies in there as well. So it's probably worth seeing if you can get a copy of it from the library.
Yeah. So it's funny about asking about book recommendations. I find myself recommending books that I've only read in part rather than their entirety. And increasingly, I have to make a choice really about whether I read a book or I just choose to read the bits that I think matter at that point in time. And what I would say is I think there's no harm in reading something as long as you read it in context. So even if you can't read the whole thing, read it in the context that it's meant to. But there is so much information out there. It's just phenomenal. It's easy to get completely overwhelmed by resources and information. But I think try it, and if you think it's interesting, then yes, I would recommend it. And if not, move on to the next one. That's my way of trying to deal with the amount of information to take in. Okay, so local support. So COVID has really shone a spotlight on the well-being of particularly the staff who work within the NHS. But I feel comfortable saying that I think Sherwood Forest was onto this long before COVID. So one of the reasons that I chose to come here to do my Chief Registrar year was because I knew that Sherwood Forest was an open-minded and progressive organisation. And we were talking about burnout in doctors. So the survey that I did went out long before COVID arrived in, well, maybe it didn't, maybe it was already here. So it went out in January, so before COVID really got ramped up. So I think that Sherwood Forest has for a long time had support in place. I think lots of places have, but I think Sherwood Forest is proactive about this, and I think they're open-minded. So all of the things that I'm going to share with you are works in progress, and feedback is very much welcome on all of them. Okay, so if you Google, for those of you who don't know, so if you Google SFH Wellbeing, it will take you to the very top link, which is the Trust's website on looking after your wellbeing during COVID-19, which should look something like this. And like I say, so COVID has brought things to the fore, but it's not going away. So this is something that we intend to build on and carry on doing, irrespective of and throughout whatever second wave of COVID there is. When we were developing this, so way back at the beginning of COVID, it was framed in the context of a wellbeing calendar and levels of self-care. And this was, the wellbeing calendar was developed with the clinical psychology team, and I think Joe's online, with a theme for each day. So if you go on the website, if you click on each of these, it takes you to, there are videos, and if you click on the 4 levels of self-care, it takes you to different resources that are available via the internet page. I think it is likely to be updated. I'm not going through a list of things that are available purely because there is so much. But for example, things like access to occupational health, access to VivUp, which is a counselling service. The chaplaincy team are really engaged with supporting staff and are open to talking to anybody, irrespective of faith or denomination. The online, there's various resources that you can access in terms of what support is out there, not just for you, but if you feel that you need to support other people. In terms of culture, there's the Freedom to Speak Up Guardians, and I know that Emma Chalmers and her team are always happy to hear from anybody about improvements or feedback. So I've deliberately haven't just reeled off a list of all of the different support that's available. And that is partly because there is so much of it. We'll be sat here all afternoon. I will just draw attention to the SFH dens. So there's one here at Kingsmill and one at Newark. And the reason I wanted to draw attention to this is, so initially during COVID, the dens were up on levels, well, the Kingsmill one was up on level 6, and you might have been aware of it. It still exists in the Faith Centre. And really why I'm drawing attention to it is we've been trying to rack our brains as to how do we centralise this? Where is it that people can go to find the support that you need? I would point people to the SFH den. If you're feeling overwhelmed by the Trust website, because not only is it in the Faith Centre, but there's loads of information down there about the different aspects of wellbeing, and I think that's really important. So wellbeing isn't one thing, as I hope I've impressed. It's something different to everybody. I think the dens are here to stay in a form. I'm sure they will evolve and develop, and any feedback would be greatly appreciated. So Kerry asked me to highlight that she's very happy to be contacted anytime for feedback, or if somebody's feeling like they need to access some support, but they're just not quite sure who to ask or where to go. And I know that the chaplaincy team and any of us, so I would be more than happy for someone to get in contact as well. Okay, so does anyone want to ask anything about local support mechanisms?
Hi, Ru. Again, I don't think there's any questions, but we've had quite a few comments in the chat box about the other forms of support as well. So there's some resilience training from the training and development team. And then a couple of thank yous from colleagues that have found the resources really useful, particularly during COVID and perhaps during a redeployment during COVID as well.
That's really good to hear.
And then there's also some resources and wellbeing support and help via the Library and Knowledge Service as well. So lots of resources and support available for staff.
Yeah. It is huge. There is a huge amount available, and it's, you know, sometimes it's it can feel a little bit overwhelming, but I think that the message to take away from that is people want to help and people want to be supportive. So even if people aren't sure which of the many resources are available to go for, ask, and the people to ask would be people like the chaplaincy team, or the champions, Kerry and her team. I'm happy to be asked, etc. But yes, there is loads out there, loads. Okay, so blue skies for wellbeing and burnout. So again, I try to think. I've been trying to think about this more and more recently. So what do I think matters for the future about wellbeing and burnout? Of all of the lessons that we've learned through COVID, and for me going back over the last 2 or 3 years, what do I think matters? So for me, I really think that it would be great if, rather than being something new that we need to champion, wellbeing just becomes part of the fabric of what we do. This recognition that, and it sounds so obvious, in order for us to provide a service that we would want our families to experience to our patients, we have to be well, we have to be in a good place, we have to want to be at work in order to give what we can to it. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think COVID has really, really highlighted it, and I hope that one of the positives we take away from COVID is that momentum, and we keep going and pushing this agenda. But I think it's also important that we learn about it. I don't think we fully understand it yet, and I don't think we all fully agree on what's what. So I think there's lots of work to do. But it is out there, and so the people plan, the NHS people plan, was released sort of recently, and I think that this has it's kind of stirred the pot a little bit, and I was reflecting on this earlier, in fact, with Kerry. So the people plan talks about what we are who are the NHS people and this promise that we make to our NHS family and to ourselves. And within wellbeing, you might call each of these individual statements affirmations. So if I was doing it as an individual, I would say, I am compassionate and inclusive. I have a voice that counts, or I will speak up if I feel something is wrong, or I will work flexibly, I will always learn. And I think these are great. These really set the ground for what we should hope to aspire to in the future. Am I convinced that we're there? I'm not convinced that we're there, but I'm really reassured that the conversation is changing. And talking to a couple of other senior clinical leaders, the way it was published, it felt very much like a mandate. So here is the people plan for the people, go away and do all of these things. And it's very easy to see contradictorily how something that is supposed to improve the working environment and the well-being of people working in it actually just caused a lot of stress and grief. And it's easy for me to say because I am not a high-level senior leader, but I choose to see it as an opportunity, and I choose to see it as this is our permission to change the way we talk about well-being and change the way we think about the environments that we're working in. And so I'll just leave you with the 4 central themes of the NHS People Plan, which is that we look after our people, that we belong in the NHS, that there is a sense of belonging for each of us, that we find new ways of working and delivering care so that we maximise the skills and experience, but also can be more inclusive so that not everyone has to work full-time all the time. And then recruiting people and making them want to come and work for us. And I just think there's a subtle change, or at least for me as someone who's relatively junior in the NHS, there's a subtle change in the way we talk about how we are as a family of colleagues in the NHS. So I'm optimistic about the future, and I'm excited to see what happens next in terms of workplace wellbeing in the NHS. And that's the end. I would leave it there unless anyone's got any questions or more comments.
I think Joanna's got her hand raised. Joanna, do you want to speak?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Hi, Jo.
Yeah, hi. I'm really sorry. I've wanted to put some stuff in the chat and my team hasn't allowed me to post anything in the chat randomly. It's been really, really helpful, and I've really valued your thoughts. I guess my question was based on your experience as a doctor, which kind of historically has, I guess, been a profession where people have just kind of sucked it up and got on with some really tough conditions, tough experiences. And there can be that sense of cynicism around, you know, some of the quite simple ideas that you've presented, which actually I know as psychologists can make a massive difference to people's well-being if they do actually put them into practice. So I just wondered what your experience was of engaging people who maybe on the surface are kind of a bit resistant to the idea, these kind of touchy-feely ideas around self-care, building resilience, compassionate leadership, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. So my experience is that, I mean, I totally agree with everything you've said. My experience is that the tone is starting to change slowly, but it's so very complicated and multifactorial. So, for example, I've had 2 conversations recently with 2 very senior consultants, one of whom said something really surprising to me, engaging with well-being and lots of the themes that I've talked about, whereas the other one said, oh yeah, all that fluffy stuff. And, you know, in one moment, I sort of wanted to like bang my head against the nearest wall because it isn't fluffy stuff. It's complicated and it's difficult and it's really confronting for people to engage with. But it's exactly that. I feel like the more we talk about it, the more open those of us who are engaged with it are about it. The more we set it as a precedent, the more people will come along and will engage with it in their own way. And that's okay. I feel comfortable with people engaging with it in their own way. I think the only exception I would say to that, which is what I've said recently in other fora, is that where those people are leading juniors, I think it's important that there's an overall trust culture where the trust sets a tone and a precedent for what it expects in terms of how we talk about well-being. Because what I don't want is for those who don't necessarily fully buy into it to influence others who would like to try it and just feel that they can't engage with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'd really agree with you. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good answer. Thanks.
That's okay. Any others? I'm happy to take. I mean, I could talk about this all afternoon, so. I
can't see any more hands raised. There's just a few comments. So Anne has put in the chat, just as a reminder, it sounds like there's quite a few people here who are passionate about wellbeing. We are currently advertising for a secondment post to develop Sherwood Forest Hospital's wellbeing services. So I'm not sure when that application closes, but that obviously sounds like a fantastic opportunity if anybody's interested in wellbeing at SFH. And then lots of thank yous, Rue. So a lot of great feedback. It's been very, very useful for people listening. Particular comment, it's been really useful and insightful. I really like how we can balance our dimensions and looking at what is and isn't in our control. Thank you so much. And then I've just seen Anne pop up. So the application closes on Sunday if anybody's interested in that wellbeing role. And then I don't think there's any other questions. If anybody's got anything else to ask, please raise your hand or just feel free to interject if you've got a microphone.
Thank you, Charlotte.
That's okay. I think that's it for questions, Rue.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'm glad it was useful. Thank you.
Now I'll just make a note that it is being recorded. So once we get the video downloaded, we'll share it with other colleagues. So if there's anything that you want to look back over, or if you wanted to write any notes, then you'll be able to do that with the catch-up link.
Thank you.
Thank you.